Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being with us. Welcome to the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium for History is Lunch. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. If you have not already, please silence your cell phones. Mark your calendars for March 19th, when poet and novelist Ron Rash will speak at the Eudora Welty House and Garden for the 6th Annual Betty Jolly Lecture. If you have not heard him before, he is terrific. The following day, March 20th, we'll kick off the new exhibit, Mississippi Distilled, Prohibition, Piety, and Politics, with a roaring 20s-themed party here at the museums that will feature live jazz, dance performances, and the first opportunity to see the new exhibit. So join us for that. And then I hope that you'll be with us next week for History's Lunch, when Frank Figures will present Stories and Secrets, the History of the Stringer Grand Lodge. We will be in the Old Capitol Museum for that, not over here. Since moving into this new facility, we have been able to live stream all these programs on the department's Facebook page. They can be watched anytime afterwards as well, and we put them up on the department's YouTube channel. So if you have trouble making it to any of these, remember that those are always good options for you. Today, we are delighted to welcome Dr. Ralph Didlake to discuss the Asylum Hill Project at the University of Mississippi Medical Center. Ralph Didlake is a graduate of the University of Mississippi and the University of Mississippi School of Medicine. He trained in general surgery, also at UMMC, and completed a surgical fellowship in organ transplantation at the University of Texas Health Science Center in Houston. After practicing transplant, general, and vascular surgery for 23 years, Dr. Didlake developed an interest in the human context of modern medical and surgical care. This interest led to a master's degree in bioethics and health policy from Loyola University. Currently, Dr. Didlake serves the University of Mississippi Medical Center as Professor of Surgery, Director of the Center for Bioethics and Medical Humanities, and Associate Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs. He is head of the Asylum Hill Project. Help me welcome Dr. Ralph Didlake.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for the introduction and especially for the invitation to share some of this rather large project with you. The Asylum Hill Project really fundamentally is about the management of a historic cemetery on the campus of the University Medical Center. But as we dig into it, no pun intended, it becomes a much bigger story. It is a story with extensive historical features, cultural features. It spans a lot of who we are and how we have lived in the past and how we might live in the future. Now, a story this big can be told in many ways. I once heard a World War II historian describe that conflict as a bottomless story. The Asylum Hill Project is approaching a bottomless story. But the way we're going to tell it today for this particular audience is we're going to start with some current context. This is the University of Mississippi Medical Center almost as it exists today. The only thing missing is our new children's hospital expansion, of which you as Mississippians will be very proud, by the way. This facility is the second largest employer in the state. It manages about 1 million patient encounters a year. It is the state's only transplant program, the only level 1 NICU, the only level 1 trauma center. It is important to the health and future of our state. Now, as you can see, we're landlocked. We're bounded on the VA Medical Center to the east and St. Dominic's Hospital, Lakeland Drive. The only undeveloped land on our campus is this green space right here. Now that will become important in just a few minutes. This land was the site of the Mississippi State Lunatic Asylum as it was officially founded in 1855 and existed on this site until 1935 when it was replaced by the current Mississippi State Hospital at Whitfield. Now, over that 80-year period, it grew to be quite a facility. This is how it looked in 1895. The central building here, numerous outbuildings. This bit up here is an inset from North President Street, ignore that. But you can see it was quite a facility. By 1925, 10 years before its closure, it had grown even larger with the addition of a hospital, a huge cow shed, had a farming operation, and it also managed a very large cemetery on its campus, up in this region right here. Now remember, we're talking about a period of time where embalming practices aren't what they are today, transportation isn't what it is today, and many of the patients during this time period who were admitted to the asylum suffered the stigma of the era. They were mental patients put there by families, often forgotten, and when they died as patients, often their bodies would not be claimed. So the asylum managed a very large cemetery. The site of that cemetery is exactly that last undeveloped land on our campus. Now, our obligations to our patients will demand that we do something with that land. Our fiduciary obligations as agents of the state to manage that valuable resource responsibly will demand at some point that we build on that space. Now, the way I would like to pause and help tell the story is to play a short video. It runs about 11 minutes. This is the work product of Ms. Lyda Gibson, who is the research coordinator for the Asylum Hill Project. Lyda, raise your hand. There you go. Don't clap yet. You haven't seen the video. This work has been supported by the Mississippi Humanities Council, and at the end we are going to pass out some evaluations. They would like a real-time evaluation of this work. But I'm going to run this video now, and it's going to run for about 11 minutes, and it will give you a thumbnail context of where we are.
In a quiet corner of the University of Mississippi Medical Center's campus stand headstones memorializing a handful of those who were once patients at the Mississippi State Lunatic Asylum at some point during its 80-year history. Of the estimated 30,000 who once walked the halls at the former institution, about 10,000 took their last breath there. Many were also In a quiet corner of the University of Mississippi Medical Center's campus stand headstones memorializing a handful of those who were once patients at the Mississippi State Lunatic Asylum at some point during its 80-year history. Of the estimated 30,000 who once walked the halls at the former institution, about 10,000 took their last breath there. Many were also buried in the asylum cemetery on the grounds of what is now a bustling campus where thousands teach, learn, heal, and research every day. And who were the people who lived in this once hallowed institution? The Asylum Hill Project aims to find out.
When the State Lunatic Asylum closed in 1935, some of the outbuildings were maintained for state offices, but the cemetery at that point was no longer maintained.
In the early 1990s, a small number of remains and headstones were relocated to the campus cemetery. In 2012, workers unearthed another pine coffin in an area slated for construction.
As a roadway was being constructed, there was an effort to determine the size of the cemetery. So formal cultural resource surveys were done.
Everyone sort of understood that there was a large cemetery, but they never really understood the number of individuals that were likely buried here. What we did was we ran a gradiometer, which is in essence, a very expensive metal detector.
It was at that time that the magnitude of the cemetery was really revealed.
In 2013 and 14, 66 burials were exhumed by archaeological teams and are currently housed at the Mississippi State University Cobb Institute of Archaeology.
These burials are unmarked, but we have a record of who was at the facility, we have a record of who died at the facility, and we have a record of who was buried, at least post-1912, of who was buried at the Asylum Cemetery.
As the project became a little more publicly known, or the proposal, we got a lot of interest from the press, and that generated interest in the community from descendants who had lots of questions.
But all I do know for certain is what my grandmother said. She was buried in Jackson. Now, at that time, she didn't know where exactly. She didn't know that she was buried on the hospital grounds.
These burials appeared to be roughly in a series of rows and fairly well organized, that they were equally spaced and all aligned and oriented the same way. And so it seemed like a very structured cemetery.
The Asylum Hill Project is an effort to manage a very large cemetery on the grounds of the University of Mississippi Medical Center that occupies the last undeveloped land on the campus. Our critical needs for care of our current and future patients demand that we build on that space. We have inherited these patients from the asylum. So we have a responsibility not just to manage them respectfully, but there's a continuity of care issue here. I think our ethical obligation is a little higher because we are a healthcare institution. That's what we do.
In its 1857 report to the legislature, the Board of Trustees of the asylum praised the new institution as a place of refuge and renewal, a realm of its own, a mansion peculiar to itself, and, quoting Shakespeare, a place to raise out the written troubles of the brain. This realm of its own, while the first one of its kind in the South, did have precedent. Thomas Kirkbride, the internationally respected Philadelphia physician, had pioneered an architectural and organizational plan that would standardize the care for the mentally ill. On January 10, 1855, the very first patient walked up the steps, through the columns, and into the asylum. She was a 29-year-old married woman from Copiah County. She died 35 years, 3 months, and 23 days later. Her diagnosis, mania.
An important part of the asylum's history is that it spanned a period of bioscience and biomedical discovery. So as more conditions were identified as being really medical conditions with psychiatric manifestations, today we would not consider them mental illness. But at that time, given the level of medical knowledge, they would have been madness of some sort.
In 1857, conditions that might lead to admission to the asylum included hereditary tendencies, domestic troubles, love, military ambition, or religious excitement.
Things that we would not hospitalize people in mental institutions for today, where they would be treated medically, like epilepsy or what we would now think is situational depression or post-traumatic stress disorder. So all of those patients are in this mix in the asylum. The descendants have played a really important role in the development of our thinking and the development of the project. They are the holders of the memories, so we need to connect with them and get as many stories and documents and information about these folks as we possibly can. We also want to help them close emotional loops if we can.
But I would like to know what it was like for her when she was a patient here. What treatments did she undergo, if any, while she was here?
What we've learned about the asylum thus far is that it was a complex institution and was not just one thing, either across time or really at any one time. It was a place where people sent people with mental illness to get better.
And we have information about those individuals. It's not just their name. We've got, how old they were, where they were from, what they died of, what they were admitted for, and those sorts of pieces of information are critical to our understanding and interpretation of not just the cemetery, but the institution of Mississippi.
My great-grandmother, her name was Zenny.
Her husband came to the asylum to visit, but he didn't come a lot because really and truly it would upset her.
I'm guessing that he didn't think that she was gonna be admitted for long. She would be treated, and he would check her out, or she would be dismissed, and he'd bring her back home. How she ended up here was that she had a mental breakdown, and I guess at that time, it was recommended that he have her committed. And she had a brother who told my great-grandfather, you need to go get her, go get Zenny. And he said, every time I go, it looks like she gets farther and farther away.
Zenny G was admitted to the asylum in August of 1920. She died 1 year, 3 days later, at age 60 of heart disease. According to her death certificate, she is among those who were buried in the hospital cemetery. In its very first year, the asylum housed 155 patients. By the mid-1920s, it was severely overcrowded with more than 2,000 on the rolls. Legislation for the new facility was passed in 1926, but political wrangling, the 1927 flood, budget constraints, and the Great Depression would delay the opening of the new facility for a full 8 years. The hospital's March 1935 move to Rankin County marked the end of an era for the asylum and its patients. But its legacy, and the legacy of its patients in the story of Mississippi, is one that must be preserved.
The historical position of the asylum from 1855 to 1935 positions it right over a critically important era in Mississippi history. Actually, multiple critically important eras in Mississippi. It spanned the antebellum period. It was present and active during the Civil War, during Reconstruction, during the Jim Crow South, during the period where medicine emerged from a trade to a profession. It also spanned the period where psychiatry became an independent professional discipline. So the history of the asylum has a lot to teach us about all of those eras of history and what role did mental health, public institutions, cultural standards, all of those things are platforms to learn more about the history, and as history does so well, to teach us more about ourselves.
Oh, we are happy to be involved with the Asylum Hill Project because now we know what happened to her. Think this was a mystery, of our family for the most part. And when you think about it, mental health is not something that's readily talked about. So to have that, plus to know that, for all we knew, she was just buried here in Jackson somewhere. We didn't even know where. So at least now we know where she is buried. This has given my family, on my grandmother's side at least, closure.
Okay. Lyda Gibson, everybody. Lyda Gibson's work. So that gives you a thumbnail sketch of what we're facing in managing this project. Let's see, let's move to this. It's certainly a big administrative issue, and the history is big, and the story can be all-encompassing. But at some level, it boils down to people, to individuals. And I'd like to show you a few of those individuals, beginning with John Whitfield. In some records, it's Whitfield, but John was a farmer in Kentucky, and things were poor. He was struggling with his young family. But he kept hearing stories that if you moved to the Mississippi Delta and raised cotton, you could get rich. He did that. He uprooted his young family and went to the Mississippi Delta in the middle of the Great Depression, and things were even worse. And as the family's history is told, he would feed his family first before he would eat himself. And he ultimately developed pellagra, vitamin deficiency, which has psychiatric manifestations. And he was admitted to the asylum for treatment. Now, another individual, Nathan Statcher. Nathan was a freedman, probably born into slavery, had some difficulties along the way, and was admitted to the asylum, where he was a patient for decades. Unfortunately, he was killed by one of the livestock that was kept at the asylum. But there's a lot in Nathan's story. You can see here where he was admitted for some domestic troubles, and here is his death certificate, and poignantly, as so many freedmen, we don't have a record of his family. There's so much that this history can tell us. Now, contrast those two stories to this one. Polly Chamberlain, born into the elite planter class of Mississippi. Her father died, then her mother died. She developed depression and was ultimately admitted to the asylum with the diagnosis of grief. 3 radically different stories, but they represent us. They represent all of Mississippi. And these 3 have in common that they are each in an unmarked grave on the campus of the medical center. Now, the historical context, the historical story would not be complete without positioning it within Mississippi's history. If you go back to the early history of our state, the 1820s and 1830s, there was legislation that was really forward-thinking about disease control, about care of the medically underserved, establishing asylums and other institutions for care, to care for people with mental illness and blindness and deafness and such. In fact, I can't resist telling this story, so forgive me. There was a fire in a hospital, a city-owned hospital in Vicksburg. Almost completely destroyed the institution. Our Mississippi legislature, late 1820s, legislated money to rebuild that hospital. In the legislation, it says the hospital will be open not only for citizens of our state, but for all citizens of the world. Now think about that for a minute. Let that soak in. Universal access to care, even for immigrants. So all of that to say that early in our state's history, there was a lot of progressive thinking about health care, including some visits by Dorothea Dix, the so-called angel of the madhouses, who lobbied our legislature to ultimately give money for the building of the asylum. This is an important piece of the total story. And it was not just it was a big effort. It was done correctly. Consultation was made with other institutions, and ultimately resulted in a state-of-the-art facility for what at that time was a state-of-the-art so-called Kirkbride facility based on Dr. Thomas Kirkbride's architectural plan of long hallways with lots of light and lots of ventilation where patients could walk and calm themselves. And you could put the more disturbed out toward the end of the wing and have the less disturbed closer to the central part of the building. So it was not a half-hearted effort. It was a real effort to have a state-of-the-art mental institution in our state. In 1900, the Mississippi State Lunatic Asylum was renamed the Mississippi State Insane Asylum. Our convention in the Asylum Hill Project is to refer to the institution as the MSA, or the Mississippi State Asylum. And as was noted in the video, there was a broad spectrum of patients there, not just folks that we would consider having mental illness today. It took care of a lot of folks. And we are building a database of these records, and as you can see, there's lots of different reasons for admission, and some of our faculty and medical students have been doing research in this area. For example, puerperal fever is the fever after childbirth. It's an infection after childbirth, as it was called back in the day. They have done an analysis and actually presented a paper analyzing those records. The history also includes the Civil War period. If you'll visit our campus, there's a plaque there commemorating the position of a Union artillery battery. It was right there at the asylum. Here's the asylum here, and the position of the battery. We have records of who manned the position, and we even have correspondence of some of the soldiers back to their relatives at home that includes some snarky comments like it's difficult to tell the patients at the asylum from the rebels. So, there you go. And here's another reminiscence by one of the superintendents. The superintendent of the asylum was the doctor who ran the place. So Dr. McCorkle had recounted a remembrance, quote unquote, of one of the patients catching cannonballs and throwing them back at the enemy. Now, as many mental institutions of the day, as happened to many mental institutions of the day, it quickly became overcrowded, and the facility did not meet the need of the community, requiring building of the East Mississippi Asylum in Meridian. And this bit of history is just waiting to be explored. This will be a huge part of the overall picture, but we haven't even addressed this part, but I'm sure that there's a rich history for that asylum as well. This gives you an idea of the rate at which overcrowding occurred. Starting from 1855 and the time of closure, there was almost 2,600 patients there. The last remaining patients were transferred to the hospital at Whitfield. As any big institution, it had its administrative problems. Some were specific to the day. With kerosene lighting, you can understand why it was plagued by fires. And as it became more and more crowded toward the end of its history, you can see how frequent significant fires were at the facility. Something that we also don't think about immediately when we think about the asylum having been on the University of Mississippi campus, it was not just the corner of North State Street and Woodrow Wilson. The asylum actually occupied 1,300 acres of land, large farming operation, large livestock operation as well. And here's some evidence of the farming operation that went on. We have some pretty extensive records in the biennial reports from the asylum of food production in an effort for the asylum to be somewhat self-sustaining. And again, some of our medical students have done a nutritional analysis to show what the nutritional level, or at least the available nutrition, was for these patients. So we're using this as a great educational platform. Now, as a surgeon, I've gotten interested in what surgery happened at the asylum. When the hospital was built in 1910, it had a fully equipped operating room, and there was a broad spectrum of surgery done at the asylum. As you would expect, a patient population of that size will occasionally require some surgical care. So this is the spectrum of procedures that were done, and they reflect a surgical practice of the day. There was also a large dental department there. One of our dental students has examined the teeth of the 66 individuals who were exhumed and reside at Mississippi State. And this dental student was very impressed by the level of dental care that was there. Fillings, modern fillings that would be considered modern for that time period, bridges, that sort of thing. So the dental care was actually readily available there and not poor by any means. Other discoveries we have made about the asylum: we had no idea that there was a nursing school there, and we are deeply indebted to a descendant of one of the graduates there for providing us these photographs. Now, as being a surgeon for a long time, I have standing to say this, so the sternness of some nurses just is timeless, just absolutely timeless. In fact, I think I worked with her. We have also been fortunate to get some of the individual patient records. Not a lot. We're negotiating with the state hospital in an effort to try to get more pre-1935 records. But this will give us a great window into the care of these patients. Right down to what they were eating and how they were responding. This is a gold mine of information to understand how care happened at the asylum. To our knowledge, this is the only interior photograph in existence of the asylum, of any building on the asylum. Now, it's my thought that this was about 15 minutes after it opened because it's nice and shiny, but it's the only extant photograph. So here we circle back. We have this big story. It's a complicated story, but we circle back to the fact that we have potentially 7,000 unmarked graves on this campus. And our obligations are to responsibly use our resources. This land that I pointed out earlier will be built on, whether it's now or 50 years from now. It will be built on. So we need to manage this cemetery appropriately. Now, cemeteries are moved all the time, not necessarily ones of this size, but they are moved all the time. But if you look at doing it at commercial rates, it's between $4,500 and $5,000 per burial to move a burial site, plus the cost of the land in which you reinter it. Now, our budget will not allow that. There's simply no way. That runs into the $40, $50 million range. But we have a plan. We have brought forward a plan that not only does it in a more cost-effective fashion, but it provides us some other opportunities. Our plan is to hire a bioarchaeologist and put him or her on our faculty at the medical center and give them the appropriate crew and equipment to do the exhumations in-house, to exhume the bodies, individually curate them at modern archaeological standards, that is, photograph, document, catalog, and put them in individual boxes, barcoded, marked in long-term storage boxes. Place those in a respectful memorial structure that not only serves as a remembrance of the lived experience of these individuals, but provides a laboratory where carefully vetted scholars can study the remains and on which we can develop educational programs. Now, if you'll notice this line, this aligns perfectly with the missions of the University of Mississippi Medical Center. We have a mission to care, provide clinical care. We have a mission to do research, and we have a mission to do education. We feel very strongly that this model that we intend to roll out mirrors perfectly the missions of the University of Mississippi Medical Center. Now, presents some challenges, no question about it. It's a big administrative job. There are ethical issues. Do we have the ethical standing to do this? Can we do this in a financially responsible way? Do we have the legal standing to do this? What history are we obligated to preserve? What are our obligations as a healthcare institution to leverage the scientific value of this site and of these remains? And when I use the term remains, I'm not just talking about bones. I'm talking about the stories and the documents, everything these individuals have left behind. We certainly have an obligation to leverage the educational value of this project. And whatever we do needs to fit into a Southern ethos, to be culturally appropriate. And that's not a simple answer to get to, because these people represent all 82 counties of our state and every demographic of our state. There are Caucasians, there are African Americans, there are Native Americans in this cemetery. So whatever we do has to be culturally sensitive and appropriate to all of these groups. Now, how does one do that? Well, this is how we're doing it. We have put together what we call the Asylum Hill Research Consortium, and we have gathered content experts in archaeology, history, bioethics, the law, preservationists, information management specialist, a dendrochronologist. I had no idea what a dendrochronologist is. They didn't teach me that in surgery school. It's someone who studies tree rings. The University of Southern Mississippi has a strong dendrochronology program, and they want to develop a physical archive of the coffin material to study the tree rings, from which they can do paleo-environmental studies and help us date the burials. And then, as you saw earlier, we have documentarians, we have medical and cultural anthropologists working with us, we have a psychiatric expert that's part of the team, and we have a philosopher, but not just any philosopher. We have someone with a PhD in philosophy who has prior experience as a neuroscientist. So we have put together these experts to make sure that this exhumation, curation, memorialization scheme is done at the very highest professional standards. Now, we've divided our project into 3 phases. Phase 1 is complete. We have formed our consortium. We've created our protocols and put together the infrastructure. We have secured 9,000 square feet of archival space at our farmers market facility at the farmers market. Our medical center's Roland Medical Library maintains this space over there. We can temporarily store remains there until we get the ultimate memorial built. We've developed our database, established a web portal for community outreach. We have done numerous events trying to engage the descendant community and get their thoughts about this. We have gotten some limited grant funding, and as we're doing today, we're doing public programming. Phase 2 is the actual exhumation of the remains, and we're working on funding for that phase now. As the remains are exhumed, we will develop field schools where archaeology and anthropology students come in to learn. Phase 2 we will do additional descendant outreach, expand our databases and our collections, and this is where we will cost effectively reclaim the land for future medical center use. Phase 3 will be the ultimate building of the memorial. That's a longer-term vision, and put the remains there. Now, the advantage of not reinterring the remains is that they are there for study in perpetuity. And if we do this correctly, we will have the largest bioarchaeological resource in the country. Now, this Asylum Hill Research Consortium represents 6 of the 8 IHL institutions. Texas State University, the archaeologist that you saw in the video, has now moved from Mississippi State to Texas State, and that's important because they have an ancient DNA lab, which may become part of this project at some point in the future. And we have a relationship with one of the dendrochronologists at Idaho State. We also have had some strong community partners that have been involved in this from the start. Happily, the Department of Archives and History, the Mississippi Humanities Council, the state hospital has been a firm partner in this, and we appreciate that, as well as the Mississippi Library Commission. We are deeply grateful for all of those partnerships. At that point, I could talk all afternoon about this project, as you might notice, but I will be happy to end my comments here and open this up to questions. Now, if you have questions, we have a microphone. Since we're live streaming this, we would like to make sure that we capture your question. And if you'll just raise your hand.
Thank you, super interesting. You talked about the temporary storage of remains while they're studied, cataloged, et cetera. Will there be some significant oversight in terms of biohazard safety with these remains while they're being temporarily studied?
Yes, great question. The American Association of Archaeologists has a set of standards that are both standards for cataloging, standards for documenting, standards for safety at field work sites, and the handling of remains. So yes, we're going to go exactly by those highest professional standards that the archaeology community gives to us.
Yes, sir. Is there anywhere going to this site, can we see the film that you showed, or is there a place that we can do that?
Lida, are we going to put the film on the website?
We will put the film on the website at some point, and it's also sort of, it will be expanding at some point too. There'll be more to the story.
Okay.
Okay, oh, yes, sorry. What, obviously there have to be many sources of funding for this project. What have you run into and what do you anticipate as the legislative / political problems associated with that funding?
Great question. There's nothing I like more than skating out on the thin edge of the ice. We are asking the legislature to fund phase 2. We feel very strongly that this is the presence of the cemetery is a state issue. It was a state institution. But I think it's a real bargain. The case we're trying to make is we're asking for about $3.6 million to do phase 2. The value of the land that is controlled by the cemetery is at the very bottom number, 18 million. So we're asking for 3.6 million to get at least $18 million worth of land. That's a bargain in anybody's book. As we have had conversations with legislators, we have had no pushback whatsoever. They see us as trying to manage this responsibly. And that's the case we continue to make, is that this is a responsible way to do this, that not only does it respectfully, but leverages all the opportunities as well. And from where I sit, 3.6 million is a lot less than the 50 million it would take to do it commercially. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yes, ma'am.
You and I have talked a little bit about the possibility of one or more books coming out of this project. I wonder if you could mention that possibility, but also what other sort of long-term public outreach might be in the plan.
Yes, there's no question that this story needs to be written. There are probably several stories within this that needs to be written. A number of people have expressed interest. Dr. Amy Forbes, who is a medical historian at Millsaps, is looking at the possibility of generating a book. We've had some initial conversations with the University Press. So yes, we intend to write the story. Now, as far as long-term public programming, I think that's a critical piece of this. There are so many opportunities to develop ways to talk about mental illness, to interest young Mississippians in science in ways that we don't have available now. There's a lot of young talent in this state, and I want to drag them all through the University of Mississippi Medical Center and show them what these careers look like. And if we can inspire kids through this, absolutely wonderful opportunity to do so. So yes, there's all sorts of long-term public programming that we see. Now, I feel very strongly that we don't want to have a museum. I never want to be in the position where we put remains or other things on display. But I do want to do public programming in a respectful way that educates.
Thank you. Thank you. Very informative. I'm wondering, from a historical point of view, since the old asylum existed through generations, and during its earlier existence, during the time of slavery, when slaves were not considered people, they were considered fractions of people, you know, 2/3 of a person. With that kind of a relationship, with them being fractions, were any slaves considered to be ill to be able to go to the, to be allowed to be in the asylum? And secondly, after that, you have a period of Jim Crow laws, segregation. During that period, were blacks allowed, or they segregated, or or they treated equally?
Two fabulous and important questions. Thank you for asking them. The first is that pre-Civil War, we don't have any records of slaves being admitted, although not every person of African American descent in Mississippi at that point was a slave. There may have been some free individuals of color. We're working on trying to answer that question. The later question about Jim Crow, the facility was segregated by race and by gender. But interestingly, the set of records that we have been able to analyze in some detail, the burial records from 1912 to 1935, indicate that the majority of the patients who were buried at that time were African American. And that raises a number of questions. Do the deaths and burials reflect the population of the asylum accurately? And if it's predominantly African American, was this an effort to provide mental health care for this group, or was this incarceration? There are lots of rich historical hypotheses that can be tested. And what we're trying to do is to be absolutely rigorous about our scholarship. Take in, as we are taught to do as bioscientists, take in no preconceived notions, but look at the data, establish hypotheses, and test them against the data. And those are really rich questions that we want to pursue. Thank you.
I'm wondering if there are any descendants here of the people who are buried on the campus, and if so, I'd love to hear from them and maybe stand in communion with them and with all who are buried there.
We have one there. There we go.
Our third great-grandfather was buried here in the late 1850s.
asylum was present in such a long period of time and represented so much of our state that you don't have to look far to find a descendant. I have a cousin, Thomas, who's buried in the...
You had mentioned the putting together the medical records of these patients, and you mentioned that you were in negotiation with the state hospital. Are there barriers there to get those records?
There are, but they're overcomable. First, there were some patients who were transferred from the asylum to Whitfield that lived many years after they went to Whitfield and are still within the 50-year HIPAA window. So those are still under the umbrella of HIPAA legislation. We are working to become a partner with the state hospital for the purpose of developing a database, a de-identified database on which we can do research. So we are entering into partnership. I don't think there will be barriers to getting this done. We just have to make sure that we comply with the law, do it respectfully, do it ethically. Great question.
You mentioned that the plan for phase 2 is to hire someone and to begin doing the work. Can you give us an idea of the timeline? So that's a lot of exhumations.
Yes, it is. You're absolutely right. If the legislature funds us this year, we can all gather for prayer after this if you'd like. We will start hiring that individual in July. It'll take us 6 months to get up and running. And from that point to clearing that land, I would suspect that to be an 8-year process, weather permitting.
Were there any children born at the facility?
Linda Gray. Yes, we have evidence of births at the asylum. Yes. We have evidence of children who were admitted. We have one burial that we know of that's 9 years old. I'd like to find that.
It was underscored this week that I am an elderly person.
I'm right there with you.
So this comes from the mind of an elderly person. You have a fiduciary responsibility to make a profit, to realize a profit on the land. You ask the question, what is our obligation to preserve history? My question is, how do you respect the dead when you're using their bones for research? How will you balance that?
Okay, very important question. There's no question that we have entered into a moral ethical calculus here. Would it be more respectful for us to just put up a plaque and walk away? What we would have is a field of unmarked graves. And we haven't really told the story as it might be told. Or is it more ethical to do this exhumation and curate these remains at modern archaeological standards and in a very tangible way bring them back into the community as full partners in our research and education programs? And let me rush to say that we are not using any remains for medical experimentation. We are studying these remains to learn more about them, about their lived history. If a scholar wants to come in and use these for any other purpose other than learning more about them, we're not going to do it. So that's the way we're going to try to do this respectfully. If we disinter and reinter, we lose all opportunity to do that. We also don't know what technologies are over the horizon. There may be ways to individually identify these remains at a low cost and in a highly efficient way. And if we do connect a name to a set of remains, then we have the opportunity to offer those remains to the descendants for conventional burial or whatever they wish to do. We lose that opportunity if we leave them in the ground and walk away or reinter them. So we have indeed wrestled with all of these moral, ethical, respectful questions, and given all of the factors, we think this is the best solution.
My father worked for what was then known as the Highway Department in Mississippi, and he was working on the project around St. Dominic's and the University Hospital. My father had very expressive eyes, and one day he came in from work, and his eyes were quite large, and he said, "Today, when we were working, we dug up bodies." Would this have been part of?
Well,
That was the 1960s.
Right. That's a great question. It depends on where he was. If it was Lakeland Drive, we have not identified anything as far north as Lakeland Drive. But if he was on the eastern boundary of between St. Dominic's and the medical center, yes, very likely. Okay, yes. These bodies go right up to that boundary. Absolutely up to that boundary.
Couple questions. You mentioned you had a cousin that was buried there?
Yes.
And the 66 people that are still, does that seem very coincidental? Out of like 30, and there were 30,000 people at the hospital, but then 66 were buried. Were they all like people without families? I mean,
well, we really don't know the answer to that. What was the total number of admissions over time?
30.
About 30,000. Okay, so we know there were 30,000 admissions. There were 10,500 deaths during that time. About 7,000 of them are buried on the campus. Only 66 have been exhumed.
and one of those was your cousin?
No, my
Okay.
cousin is still in the cemetery.
Okay.
But we have not identified those 66.
Yeah. Well, those were most likely all African Americans, yeah?
The 66 or we don't know. You can't look at a set of bones just by visual inspection and identify their race.
No, you can't, but we know there were 30,000 people there, 10,000 of them died, 66 were buried, the math just doesn't really
Yeah,
seem-
66 have been dug up.
Dr. Didlake, I just want everybody here to know that you are from Copiah County. And we are very proud of you and grateful for your service to our state. Thank you, sir.
Well, I have never had higher praise than from Justice Kitchen. Thank you.
Sir, thank you so much for being here and for a wonderful presentation. Several years ago, there was a presentation made about the facility at Whitfield, and they were showing some of the historical elements. And one of the treatment facilities they had there were large tanks of water that they would put patients in. These were very large tanks of water, and I was wondering what the rationale was for that, and was it effective?
Yeah, hydrotherapy is what that was referred to, and it evolved over the years. It evolved from just a calming warm bath to more like a sitz bath bidet kind of thing. And then if you go out to the present museum at Whitfield, you'll see what's referred to as a Scotch shower. That's a needle spray apparatus that the psychiatrist would actually write a prescription for spray on the upper part of the body at a certain temperature for a certain time and spray on the bottom. And there's also some of the large tanks that have canvas covers where they would put a patient in to calm them over a long period of time and just let them remain. So hydrotherapy has a long history. Was it effective? Well, it's what they had. This was before neuropharmacology had progressed, and you had other chemical means to calm patients. How effective it was? Probably not a lot. Probably yes in a small number of patients, but it's what they had. It's a great question, great piece of medical history there.
We have come to the top of another hour. As usual, we have more questions than we have time for. It's one of the best things about the series. I am sure Dr. Didlake and Lida would be glad to field those for you afterwards. Lida is passing out assessment forms for the Humanities Council, and if you didn't get one of those, please fill one out for them, help them out with that. Thank you all for being here. I remind you that we will be at the Old Capitol for History is Lunch next week. Please join us for that. But today, help me thank Ralph Didlake for this wonderful program.
Thank you all. I appreciate it. Thanks.